Usually when we talk about climate change, there's this very specific, almost universal visual vocabulary we rely on. I mean, we picture a towering concrete smokestack with dark plumes billowing into the sky.
Right, or an endless highway packed with cars.
Exactly. Exhaust pouring out of millions of tailpipes.
Mm.
It's a very industrial paradigm. It's this mechanical equation we've all been taught. You extract a fossil fuel, you combust it in a machine, carbon dioxide goes up, and the planet warms.
It's very linear, and frankly, it's a visual we're comfortable with because, well, we built those machines. We understand the physical architecture of that kind of pollution.
We do. But the moment you step into the world of agriculture, specifically the global agri-food system, that entire tailpipe paradigm just completely shatters.
It really does. You're suddenly looking at a landscape of emissions that is entirely biological.
Yeah, it is invisible, it breathes, it digests, and it is vastly more complex than a combustion engine. And our mission for today's deep dive is to completely dismantle that old industrial image in your mind. Because when you look at the raw data from 2023, the global agri-food system hit an astonishing 16.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent.
To contextualize a number that massive, I mean, we really have to look at the trajectory. That 16.5 billion tons represents a 21% increase just since the year 2000.
Wow, just since 2000.
Yeah, it's a staggering upward curve. And when you break open that aggregate number to see what is actually driving the acceleration, the livestock sector just emerges as the dominant force.
Right.
Depending on how the scientific community draws the system boundaries, whether they're isolating just the farm gate activities or conducting a comprehensive life cycle assessment from fertilizer to supermarket refrigeration, major scientific bodies place the contribution of livestock between 12 and 19.6% of total global greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if livestock accounts for up to 19.6% of global emissions, that means the dietary consumption of animal products is on par with or potentially exceeding the emissions of the entire global transportation sector.
Yes, exactly.
We're talking about every single car commuting right now, every semi-truck on the highway, every massive cargo ship crossing the Pacific, and every commercial airplane in the sky combined.
It's a profound realization. And just the farm gate activities alone, meaning the physical reality of raising the crops, feeding the animals, and managing the land before an animal even leaves for a processing plant, that accounts for 8.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent.
And unlike the energy or transportation sectors, where the emissions profile is dominated almost exclusively by carbon dioxide from burning coal or gas.
Right, the climate footprint of animal agriculture is an incredibly intricate interplay of biogenic fluxes.
Biogenic fluxes, right?
Yeah, we aren't just dealing with CO2. We're dealing with massive volumes of methane from digestive tracts. We're dealing with nitrous oxide volatilizing off of soil and manure. And we're dealing with the sudden release of deeply sequestered carbon dioxide resulting from land use changes.
So we aren't just dealing with a simple story of cow being a fuzzy little pollution factory.
Right.
If we want to truly grasp this, we have to look under the hood of the global food engine.
Absolutely.
We have to map the thermodynamics, the evolutionary biology, the complex soil chemistry, and what economists call carbon opportunity costs. And to understand the macro scale, the atmospheric data that climate modeling supercomputers spit out, we actually have to start our journey by zooming all the way in.
Down to the microscale.
Exactly. We need to look at the microscale evolutionary biology, specifically the primary engine driving these biogenic emissions, the ruminant digestive system.
The ruminant digestive tract is an evolutionary marvel. I mean, we are talking about cattle, sheep, goats, buffalo. These animals have evolved to exploit an ecological niche by doing something that monogastric animals, creatures with a single-chambered stomach like humans, pigs, and poultry, absolutely cannot do.
Which is digesting grass, essentially.
Yes. They can extract metabolic energy from highly fibrous plant material, specifically the complex polysaccharides known as cellulose and hemicellulose.
Stuff we can't digest at all.
Not even a little bit. Monogastrics simply lack the genetic instructions to produce the enzymes required to break the rigid beta-1-YL4 glycosidic bonds that hold plant cell walls together. If you or I were to eat a bowl of raw pasture grass, it would pass through our system entirely undigested, yielding zero caloric value.
But a cow isn't relying on its own mammalian enzymes to break down that grass, is it?
Hmm.
It has basically outsourced the biochemistry to an entire internal ecosystem.
That's precisely it. It relies on the rumen.
That's the rumen.
The rumen is the defining feature of these animals. It is a massive pregastric fermentation chamber. In a mature dairy cow, the rumen can hold upwards of 40 to 50 gallons of material.
That is massive.
It really is. It's a dark, warm, strictly anaerobic, meaning completely oxygen-free liquid environment that hosts a breathtakingly complex and highly competitive symbiotic ecosystem of microorganisms.
We're talking about bacteria, right?
Bacteria, yes, but also dense populations of specialized protozoa and anaerobic fungi.
Fungi inside the stomach.
Yes, the fungi play a crucial role. When a cow grazes and swallows forage, those microbial populations immediately attack the plant matter. The fungi physically penetrate the rigid lignin crust of the plant, opening up microscopic surface area.
Oh, wow.
Then, the bacteria secrete extracellular enzymes that hydrolyze or chemically cleave those complex cellulose polymers down into simple, soluble sugars.
But the cow doesn't just absorb those sugars directly, right? Because the microbes are doing the work, I assume they get first pass at the energy.
That is the absolute crux of the symbiotic relationship. Those soluble sugars immediately undergo anaerobic fermentation by the microbes themselves.
Because there's no oxygen.
Exactly. Because there is no oxygen available in the rumen to fully oxidize the sugars into pure carbon dioxide and water, which is what happens in our own aerobic cellular respiration, the microbes ferment the sugars to produce short-chain fatty acids.
Primarily volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, right?
Yes. The most abundant of these are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These VFAs are then absorbed directly across the dense papillae lining the rumen wall and enter the cow's bloodstream.
So that is the fundamental mechanism of ruminant energy transfer. That's literally how a cow turns indigestible pasture grass into 1,000 pounds of muscle mass, or gallons of milk.
Conceptually, it is an incredibly elegant biological workaround. But here is where the problem starts.
Thermodynamic trap.
Yes, there is a profound thermodynamic trap hidden right in the middle of this fermentation process. Let's look at the actual chemistry occurring inside that vat. When those microbial populations oxidize the carbohydrates to create acetate,
Which happens to be the dominant pathway when an animal is eating a high-fiber diet like grass, right?
correct. When they form acetate, the chemical reaction inherently cleaves off and releases metabolic hydrogen, represented simply as H2, along with carbon dioxide, directly into the rumen fluid.
So you have a rapid buildup of pure hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide just bubbling inside the cow's stomach.
And that accumulation of free hydrogen is highly toxic to the thermodynamics of the fermentation process itself.
Toxic. How?
Well, in any chemical environment, if you allow the end products of a reaction to build up, the reaction eventually slows down and stops. If that metabolic hydrogen were allowed to accumulate, the partial pressure of hydrogen gas in the rumen would rise dramatically.
What happens when the pressure rises?
It thermodynamically inhibits a highly sensitive, universally crucial cellular process, specifically the reoxidation of a specific coenzyme called NADH back to NAD+.
I want to make sure we really visualize this, because it's the physical key to the whole climate problem. It's like a crowded nightclub. If the hydrogen molecules don't constantly leave through the exit doors, the room gets so physically packed that the metabolic bouncers, these NAD+ enzymes that keep the energy flowing, literally don't have the physical space to do their jobs.
That is a perfect physical analogy.
They can't grab the next molecule, the whole club just shuts down.
Exactly. The regeneration of NAD+ is the non-negotiable prerequisite for the continued activity of dehydrogenases. Those are the specific enzymes driving glycolysis and the initial breakdown of the plant fiber.
So if the room gets too crowded with hydrogen, NAD+ cannot be regenerated.
Right. The microbial enzyme seize up and the digestion of the grass completely halts. The entire biogenic engine fails. If this mechanism isn't resolved, the animal would literally starve to death with a stomach completely full of grass.
Simply because the microbial machinery locked up. So the cow desperately needs a biological exhaust system. It needs a way to continuously vent that hydrogen out of the nightclub so the fermentation can keep running.
What's fascinating here is how the host animal relies on an incredibly ancient group of microorganisms to step in and save its digestion. The rumen requires a highly efficient hydrogen disposal mechanism to maintain a low partial pressure. Enter the methanogenic archaea.
Commonly known as methanogens. Archaea. So we aren't talking about bacteria anymore. This is an entirely different domain of life on the phylogenetic tree.
Very different. They are biologically distinct from both bacteria and eukaryotes. Archaea are some of the oldest, most resilient life forms on Earth.
They're usually found in extreme environments, right?
Yes, they are strictly anaerobic, often found thriving in places like deep-sea hydrothermal vents or boiling hot springs, and genomic surveys of rumen microbiome studies looking across 32 different ruminant species, from domesticated cattle to wild deer, reveal that this exhaust process is driven by an incredibly highly conserved set of microbes.
Meaning they're basically the same across all these species.
Roughly 74% of all rumen archaea belong to just two dominant clades, with the absolute most prominent organism being Methanobrevibacter gottschalki.
Methanobrevibacter gottschalki. So if this archaea is acting as the bouncer clearing out the club, what exactly is its chemical mechanism? How does it clear the hydrogen?
It performs a process known as hydrogenotrophic methanogenesis. These methanogens actually utilize that dangerous excess hydrogen as their primary energy source.
Oh, they eat it.
Essentially, yes. They scavenge the free hydrogen and use it to reduce the carbon dioxide that is also floating around in the rumen.
The stoichiometric equation is beautiful in its simplicity.
Let's hear the math.
The archaea take 1 molecule of carbon dioxide, combine it with 4 molecules of hydrogen, and synthesize 1 molecule of methane CH4 along with 2 molecules of water.
Ah, methane.
Yes. By constantly scavenging and consuming that hydrogen fuel, the methanogens maintain the strict thermodynamic equilibrium necessary for the bacteria and fungi to keep digesting the plant fiber. So the cow is essentially a walking, breathing fermentation tank. And methane is nothing more than the biological exhaust valve, keeping the entire thermodynamic system from seizing up.
The methane is a waste product of a microbial waste disposal system, but it is a waste product that contains an immense amount of locked-up chemical energy.
Right, because methane is natural gas. It is literally flammable energy, the exact same gas we pipe into our homes to boil water on a stove, and the cow is just burping it away into the sky.
It is.
The source notes that typically 2 to 12% of the animal's gross energy intake is completely lost to this biological venting process.
Which is a huge energy leak.
It really is. It's expelled into the atmosphere primarily through eructation, which is the clinical term for belching, with a very minor fraction escaping as flatulence. If you think about it from an engineering perspective, it's astoundingly inefficient.
From a pure energy conversion standpoint, yes.
You are taking precious calories from sunlight, captured by plants through photosynthesis, pouring them into this biological machine, and the machine is throwing up to 12% of that energy away as a highly potent greenhouse gas just to keep its own internal engine running.
It is a deeply inefficient system. But, evolution doesn't optimize for global climate stability. Evolution optimizes for the immediate survival and reproduction of the organism in a given environment.
Right, survival of the fittest.
For the ancestral ruminant, sacrificing 10% of its ingested energy to methanogens is a highly acceptable evolutionary tax to pay. In exchange for that tax, the animal gains the superpower of extracting the remaining 90% of energy from vast grasslands that other animals simply cannot digest.
Which brings us to a fascinating physiological pivot point. Because if the methane is a chemically unavoidable byproduct of how the animal breaks down its food, the obvious question you, the listener, are probably asking right now is, well, can we just change what they digest?
A very logical question.
Right. If the grass is causing the hydrogen buildup, can we feed them something different to alter the chemistry?
This is where we encounter the profound complexity of what we can call the diet paradox. The total volume of enteric methane produced by a ruminant is intricately, mathematically linked to its specific diet.
How so?
Specifically, it is governed by the ratio of forage, meaning fibrous materials like grass, hay, and silage to concentrate, which means starchy grains like corn, barley, or soy.
And this is where the popular, culturally ingrained image of sustainable agriculture collides violently with biochemical reality. Because if you ask someone to picture sustainable, climate-friendly, ethical beef, they almost certainly picture a herd of cattle out on an open, sprawling green pasture, eating grass exactly as nature intended.
It feels right. It looks right.
It's an incredibly powerful, idyllic image.
But the underlying biochemistry tells a starkly different story. When cattle consume those high-fiber diets on an open pasture, the microbial fermentation pathway in the rumen heavily favors the production of acetate.
And as we mapped out a moment ago, the specific biochemical cleavage that forms acetate inherently releases a large volume of metabolic hydrogen.
Correct. More hydrogen saturating the rumen means more substrate available for the methanogenic archaea. Therefore, more acetate inevitably directly leads to a higher output of methane gas per unit of food consumed.
So if grass equals acetate, which releases hydrogen, which fuels methane, what happens when you take that cow completely off the pasture, put it in a highly industrialized feedlot, and feed it a densely concentrated diet of corn and starch?
The entire microbial architecture and fermentation chemistry of the rumen shifts. When cattle consume diets that are highly concentrated in starch or easily soluble sugars, the rumen pH drops.
It gets more acidic.
Exactly. The microbial populations alter, and the system shifts rapidly away from acetate and toward the production of a different volatile fatty acid called propionate.
So if propionate is taking over, that chemical equation must be fundamentally different. Are they somehow locking that hydrogen up instead of venting it?
That is exactly what is happening. The biochemical formation of propionate acts as a competitive hydrogen sink within the rumen.
Oh, sink.
Yes. Instead of cleaving off and releasing hydrogen into the fluid, the creation of propionate actively requires and consumes it. The chemical pathway is glucose plus 2 molecules of free hydrogen yields 2 molecules of propionate and 2 molecules of water.
So it's sucking up the hydrogen.
By chemically binding up that free metabolic hydrogen into the propionate molecule itself, the process drastically reduces the amount of free hydrogen available to float around the rumen.
And no free hydrogen fuel means the methanogenic archaea literally have nothing to build methane out of.
Precisely.
Wait, if we follow that logic, it means that intensive, concentrated, industrialized feedlot systems are actually generating less direct enteric methane than cattle grazing happily on a regenerative pasture. A feedlot cow burping less than a grass-fed cow.
On a per kilogram of meat produced basis, the data is unequivocal. Grain-finished feedlot cattle typically produce significantly less direct enteric methane than pasture-raised cattle.
That is wild.
Furthermore, because the grain diet is so incredibly energy-dense, they grow much faster. They reach slaughter weight in a much shorter time frame, which means fewer total days alive on the earth, burping methane, while simultaneously suppressing the daily rate of methane production through that propionate pathway.
That is an incredibly difficult concept to reconcile. It feels deeply wrong on an ecological level because we all know the massive cascading environmental costs of growing that industrial feedlot grain.
Yes, the corn and the soy.
We are talking about the endless plowing of monocultures, the decimation of topsoil, the chemical runoff from pesticides.
You are identifying the ultimate inescapable trade-off in the architecture of animal agriculture. It perfectly illustrates why optimizing the system is so devilishly complex. We will explore this deeply when we unpack the feed-fossil nexus later, but you are essentially engaging in environmental accounting arbitrage.
Arbitrage, right.
You can dramatically lower the direct biogenic methane emission from the animal itself by feeding it grain. But in doing so, you drastically increase the fossil fuel emissions, land use alterations, and supply chain intensity required to grow, harvest, heavily process, and transport thousands of tons of concentrated corn to that feedlot.
It's like squeezing a massive balloon. You squeeze the methane emissions down on the farm by shifting the diet, and the emissions just pop out somewhere else in the industrial supply chain.
Exactly.
But before we leave the biology of the animal itself, we have to look at the other meats on the table, because we've spent this entire time talking exclusively about ruminants. What about the monogastrics? What about pork and chicken, which make up a massive portion of the global diet?
The contrast here is profound, and it is entirely dictated by physiology. Pigs and poultry possess a simple, single-chambered stomach.
Like us.
Like us. Their digestive process does not rely on a 50-gallon vat of fermenting microbes stationed before the stomach. Instead, their digestion relies primarily on their own internal enzymatic breakdown and acid hydrolysis of food.
So they're fundamentally lacking that thermodynamic trap. They don't have the hydrogen buildup, so they don't need the archaea bouncers.
Exactly. While some very minor fermentation does occur much later in their digestive tract, specifically in the large intestine or hind gut, the scale and volume of methane production is virtually negligible compared to the massive foregut fermentation of a ruminant.
Negligible.
Because chickens and pigs do not function as primary biological emitters of enteric methane, their carbon footprints are driven almost entirely by upstream external factors. We measure the energy used to grow their feed, the massive fossil fuel inputs required to heat or cool their large confinement barns, and the diesel burned in the transportation networks.
So the biology of the animal sets a hard, inescapable baseline. A farm can optimize its supply chain perfectly. It can engineer the most aerodynamically efficient transport trucks. It can put a massive solar array on the roof of the barn.
But it cannot fundamentally change the evolutionary blueprint of a cow's stomach.
Right. The data the sources provide here is stark. Beef has a median carbon footprint of nearly 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for every single kilogram of meat produced.
100 kilograms.
Poultry, by contrast, sits at approximately 10 kilograms per kilogram of meat. Beef is an entire order of magnitude more intensive, precisely because the physical body of the animal is a primary emission source.
And that biological reality dictates the limits of our interventions. For ruminants, no amount of downstream supply chain optimization can fully mitigate their footprint because the engine powering the system is fundamentally evolutionarily designed to emit carbon into the atmosphere.
So we've exhaustively mapped the emissions coming from the front end of the animal, the methane expelled during the extraction of energy. But the biological throughput doesn't stop there.
It certainly doesn't.
What goes in must come out. The carbon and the hydrogen were vented, but the nitrogen the animal consumed has to go somewhere. And that brings us to the back end of the agricultural system, and a deeply problematic, often invisible element of climate science. We need to talk about the nitrogen cascade and the manure management paradox.
This is a critical vector of the climate crisis that frequently gets entirely overshadowed by the media's focus on methane.
Everyone loves talking about the burbs.
They do. While methane garners significant headlines because of its immediate, powerful, short-term warming effect in the atmosphere, the livestock sector is simultaneously the primary driver of a massive global perturbation in the nitrogen cycle. And the direct consequence of overloading that cycle is the widespread emission of nitrous oxide, or N2O.
We are constantly saturated with data about CO2 and methane, but nitrous oxide is truly the quiet, heavyweight champion of greenhouse gases. The numbers on its global warming potential are staggering. Nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat over a 100-year horizon.
298 times. That multiplier means that even microscopic leaks in a farm's nitrogen cycle, tiny biochemical inefficiencies in how soil or manure processes waste, translate into massive, disproportionate climate forcing.
Wow.
A single kilogram of nitrous oxide venting from a wet field traps as much heat as nearly 300 kilograms of CO2 billowing from a smokestack. And the global handling of livestock manure is a primary engine for generating it.
How exactly does that happen? What is the physical biochemistry occurring inside a pile of manure sitting on a farm?
When livestock consume their feed, whether it's pasture grass or high-protein soy, they only metabolize a fraction of the nutrients for bodily growth. They excrete a highly significant portion of the volatile solids and the nitrogen they ingested.
In their urine and dung.
Yes. Once that manure leaves the animal and hits the ground, it immediately begins a complex process of microbial decomposition. Now, depending on the environment, the decomposition of manure can release both methane and nitrous oxide. But here is the cruel, inescapable biochemical irony of the system. The specific environmental conditions that favor the creation of one gas are mutually exclusive to the conditions that favor the creation of the other.
Another paradox.
Yeah.
So if you solve one, you inherently cause the other.
Let's trace the pathway of nitrous oxide first. N2O is generated primarily through a microbial process known as the nitrification-denitrification cycle.
Nitrification-denitrification.
Yes. This cycle is fundamentally driven by fluctuating, unstable oxygen levels. For microbes to strip oxygen away from nitrogen compounds and vent N2O as a byproduct, they require an environment that transitions back and forth between being aerobic, meaning it has access to oxygen, and being anaerobic, meaning it is starved of oxygen.
Where exactly do you find an environment fluctuating like that on a working farm?
You find it in any system where manure is handled as a solid mass. Think of a massive dry feedlot, a huge steaming compost stack, or crucially a grazing pasture.
A pasture?
In a solid manure pile, the outer surface is continually exposed to the ambient air and remains aerobic, while the deep, compacted interior is starved of oxygen and becomes anaerobic. Or consider the soil of a pasture. A heavy rainfall might temporarily waterlog the soil, completely displacing the oxygen and creating anaerobic conditions.
And then it dries out.
Then, over a few days, the sun comes out, the soil dries, oxygen returns, and it becomes aerobic again. These constantly shifting gradients are the absolute perfect breeding ground for the specific microbes that drive denitrification.
Which brings us crashing right back into the idyllic image of the cow on the green pasture. We just established that grass-fed cows burp far more methane because of the acetate pathway. But if I'm following your logic on the oxygen fluctuations in the soil, you are telling me the pasture itself is also a massive active source of nitrous oxide.
The data strongly confirms that. It is the pasture paradox. When grazing animals are roaming a field, they obviously do not distribute their waste in a mathematically even layer.
Right, it's clustered.
They deposit highly concentrated, localized patches of urine and dung directly onto the soil surface. The specific concentration of nitrogen in those small, localized patches is astronomically high. It far, far exceeds the biological uptake capacity of the grass roots growing directly underneath it. The plant simply cannot absorb and utilize that much raw nitrogen that fast.
So if the plant can't use it, the nitrogen just sits there in the soil. And what happens to it?
It becomes highly vulnerable to volatilization. The specialized microbes in the soil immediately go to work on that excess nitrogen. The nitrification-denitrification cycle kicks into high gear, and as the soil moisture fluctuates, that excess unused nitrogen is vented directly into the sky as highly potent N2O.
Just off-gassing into the atmosphere.
The historical data tracking this is striking. Over a 50-year period from 1961 to 2014, nitrous oxide emissions from managed pastures accounted for more than 3/4 of all N2O emissions originating from grazing lands globally.
That is incredible. So if handling manure as a solid or leaving it on a pasture essentially creates a nitrous oxide factory, what happens if a large-scale farm decides to manage the waste entirely as a liquid? Like those massive engineered slurry lagoons you see at industrial dairy or pork operations.
That is where the impossible whack-a-mole trade-off becomes brutally clear. If an operation flushes all that manure into a deep, highly concentrated liquid lagoon, they create an environment that is strictly, permanently anaerobic.
Because it's a deep pool of liquid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no fluctuating oxygen. It is completely starved of it. Because the microbes lack the shifting anaerobic gradients they need, direct nitrous oxide emissions from the lagoon drop to almost zero.
If N2O is 298 times worse than CO2, dropping it to zero sounds like a massive environmental win.
It would be, except for the underlying biology of the liquid itself. A deep, stagnant, oxygen-free liquid lagoon full of organic volatile solids is the absolute perfect, optimal environment for our old friends from the rumen, the methanogenic archaea. The exact same clades of microbes that thrive inside the cow's stomach thrive at the bottom of a manure lagoon. They feast on the organic matter and release massive, continuous plumes of methane gas bubbling up to the surface.
So liquid systems successfully minimize direct nitrous oxide, but they maximize methane. Solid systems in pastures successfully minimize manure methane because the material is exposed to oxygen, but they maximize nitrous oxide.
You quite literally just choosing your poison.
You design a multi-million-dollar waste management system to suppress the methane, and the biology responds by venting a superpollutant nitrous oxide. You change the system to stop the nitrous oxide, and it aggressively burps out methane. There is no zero-emission way to manage millions of tons of biologically active waste.
And it is vital to note that even the liquid lagoon solution is only a temporary geographical displacement. Eventually, those massive lagoons reach capacity.
They have to empty them.
Right. That liquid slurry must be pumped out and sprayed onto agricultural fields as a fertilizer. The moment that nitrogen-rich liquid hits the soil, the oxygen levels begin to fluctuate, the microbes wake up, and a massive delayed burst of nitrous oxide is released into the atmosphere anyway.
It seems like managing the waste after the fact is just a losing battle. Is there any way to mitigate this entire cycle at the source? Like, can we just give the animals less nitrogen to begin with so there's less excess coming out the back end?
That concept is actually one of the primary mitigation frontiers being developed right now, known as precision feeding. The intensity of manure emissions is fundamentally a function of dietary feed efficiency.
Meaning how well the animal actually uses what it eats.
Historically, and still quite often today, livestock are fed diets with crude protein levels that far exceed their actual baseline nutritional requirements, simply as an insurance policy to guarantee maximal growth rates. In ruminants, any excess dietary nitrogen that the animal doesn't synthesize into muscle mass or secrete in milk is processed by the liver, converted into urea, and excreted in the urine.
And once that highly concentrated urine hits the ground,
Once the urine hits the soil, an enzyme called urease rapidly hydrolyzes the urea into ammonia. Ammonia is incredibly volatile. It immediately enters the soil ecosystem, and it rapidly becomes a prime substrate for nitrous oxide production.
so precision feeding tries to stop that.
Yes. By implementing precision feeding, which involves analyzing the feed composition daily and matching the specific amino acid profile strictly to the metabolic needs of the animal, down to the gram, a farm can significantly reduce the volume of excess nitrogen excreted in the urine.
Down to the gram, that sounds intense.
However, While that precise biochemical control works brilliantly in a highly managed, high-tech indoor swine or poultry facility, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to implement in extensive pasture-based grazing systems.
Right, because you can't test the grass as they eat it.
Exactly. A farmer cannot control the exact protein content of every single blade of grass a cow eats on a Tuesday.
So we've looked extensively at the biological realities of the animal, and we've mapped the complex chemistry of the waste. But if we go back a step, we previously noted that monogastrics, like chickens and pigs, and even grain-finished feedlot beef, have lower direct biogenic emissions from the animal itself because they aren't fermenting roughage.
Right, they don't have the rumen trap.
But they require massive amounts of concentrated grain feed. And that begs the macroeconomic question, where exactly does all that feed come from? This transitions us perfectly from the messy, wet biology of the farm into the realm of heavy industrial chemistry. We need to talk about the embedded fossil fuels, or what the sources define as the feed-fossil nexus.
To truly understand the carbon footprint of a chicken breast sitting on your plate, you have to conceptually realize that a massive, overwhelming component of that footprint was not generated on the farm where the chicken lived.
It's embedded.
It is embedded in the production of the feed crops, the millions upon millions of acres of corn, wheat, barley, and soy. And the massive cultivation of those specific crops introduces a deep, structural, unbreakable link between animal agriculture and the global fossil fuel extraction industry.
And that deep structural link is essentially forged by what is arguably one of the most consequential, world-altering scientific discoveries of the early 20th century. We have to talk about the Haber-Bosch process.
It is genuinely impossible to overstate the historical and ecological importance of the Haber-Bosch process. It is the absolute foundational cornerstone of modern global feed production.
Because before this, how did we get nitrogen?
For all of human history prior to 1909, agricultural expansion was strictly limited by the amount of naturally occurring reactive nitrogen available in the soil, which had to be replenished by crop rotation, manure, or mining finite resources like guano islands.
Bird poop, essentially.
Exactly. Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch broke that biological limit. They engineered an industrial process that synthesizes pure ammonia NH3 by taking inert nitrogen gas straight out of the ambient atmosphere and chemically forcing it to combine with hydrogen.
But chemically forcing that reaction requires an astonishing, almost violent amount of energy. You are trying to break the triple bond of a nitrogen molecule, right, N2, which is one of the strongest, most stable chemical bonds in all of nature. The atoms desperately want to stay together.
Exactly. To force those nitrogen atoms apart so they can bond with hydrogen, the Haber-Bosch process requires immense, continuous industrial heat, often around 500 degrees Celsius, and extreme atmospheric pressure, upwards of 400 atmospheres.
And where does the energy to generate that kind of heat and pressure come from?
It comes from burning massive quantities of fossil fuels. Furthermore, the immense volume of pure hydrogen gas required for the reaction doesn't just spontaneously appear. It is almost entirely stripped from natural gas methane through a highly carbon-intensive process called steam methane reforming, or it is derived from the gasification of coal.
So to create the synthetic fertilizer that grows the dense corn that feeds the chicken, humanity literally has to extract natural gas from the earth, burn a portion of it to generate 500 degrees of heat, and use the rest of the natural gas as a direct chemical feedstock to harvest the hydrogen.
Yes. The global production of synthetic fertilizer is one of the most fossil fuel-intensive industries on the planet. And this creates a compounding, devastating emission effect, a double hit to the climate ledger.
Walk us through the double hit.
First, immense amounts of fossil fuels are combusted at the massive chemical plants to synthesize the fertilizer, releasing millions of tons of pure CO2 into the atmosphere. Second, that newly synthesized nitrogen fertilizer is bagged, shipped to an agricultural basin, and applied heavily to the soil to maximize corn yields.
And once it hits the soil,
As we just exhaustively discussed, a highly significant portion of that synthetic nitrogen volatilizes and is released by microbes as superpotent nitrous oxide.
and here is where we connect the chemical plant back to the meat aisle. Because we aren't just growing this hyper-fertilized corn for humans to eat. The sheer scale of the global feed economy is staggering. The research data indicates that roughly 1/3 of total global cereal production is diverted away from human consumption and fed directly to livestock.
That is the crucial metric. 1 out of every 3 rows of grain grown on the entire planet is destined for an animal's stomach, not a human's. Therefore, a proportional one-third share of all those massive industrial emissions, the natural gas violently combusted at the Haber-Bosch plant, the nitrous oxide venting invisibly from the fertilized soil, the diesel fuel burned by the massive combine harvesters, is entirely conceptually embedded in the meat and dairy products we ultimately consume.
So what does this all mean? If you're listening to this while cooking dinner, look at the chicken breast or the pork chop on your counter. You might look at the chicken and think, well, chickens don't have a rumen, they don't burp methane, so this is a low-carbon, highly efficient choice.
Thermodynamically speaking, it's not that simple.
Right. By eating that chicken breast, you are indirectly consuming the natural gas that was extracted from a well and burned in a fertilizer plant hundreds of miles away just to grow the heavily fertilized corn to feed the bird.
That is exactly the correct framework to view it through. You are eating embodied fossil fuels. And for monogastrics like poultry and pigs, which are fundamentally dependent on high-protein, highly digestible feed, the logistical supply chains stretch across the entire globe.
Right, soy complex.
We have to look at the massive global soy complex. Soybean meal is the premier foundational protein source for global livestock, but the carbon footprint of that specific soy is heavily dependent on its geography of origin.
Because if it comes from the Amazon,
if the soy is grown on recently deforested land in the Amazon basin, heavily fertilized, loaded onto diesel-burning freight trains, transferred to massive bunker fuel-burning Panamax cargo ships, and shipped across the ocean to feed pigs in indoor confinement facilities in Europe or China, the transportation, processing, and land use emissions embedded in that single pork chop are astronomical.
and the relationship between growing animal feed and burning fossil fuels gets even more tangled and bizarre when we look at government energy policies that try to intervene. The source material highlights the energy agriculture feedback loop, specifically pointing to the United States Renewable Fuel Standard as a prime example.
The RFS is a fascinating, highly complex example of how attempting to solve an energy sector problem created massive, unintended agricultural ripple effects. The RFS mandated the blending of biofuels, primarily ethanol distilled from corn, into the national commercial gasoline supply.
The idea was to stop relying on foreign oil.
The geopolitical intention was to reduce reliance on imported foreign oil and boost domestic energy security. But by aggressively mandating ethanol production, the policy inextricably linked the agricultural commodity market for corn directly to the global energy market for crude oil.
It essentially turned a bushel of corn into a barrel of oil, economically speaking.
The markets became entirely coupled. And this sudden, massive, artificially mandated demand for corn to be fermented into ethanol drove commodity prices to record highs. This price surge encouraged farmers to cultivate marginal lands, prairies, and grasslands that were providing ecosystem services and shouldn't necessarily be tilled.
They just needed more land to grow corn because it was so profitable.
Furthermore, to capitalize on the high prices, it heavily incentivized the dramatically increased application of synthetic Haber-Bosch fertilizer to absolutely maximize the yield per acre, which, as we know, directly drives up localized N2O emissions.
But cars don't eat the whole corn kernel, right?
Yeah.
You ferment the sugar for the fuel, but there is a massive biological byproduct left over from the distillery.
Correct. When an ethanol plant ferments industrial corn, it extracts the starches to distill the alcohol for fuel. What is left over at the end of the process is a massive volume of a product called distiller's dried grains with solubles, or DDGS. It is a highly concentrated matrix of plant protein and fiber. And what does the market do with millions of tons of industrial DDGS? It sells it extremely cheaply as a premier livestock feed, particularly to supplement the diets of feedlot cattle and highly productive dairy cows.
If you are an environmental scientist trying to do the math on this, it is an absolute accounting nightmare. I mean, how do you even calculate the footprint of the animal? The carbon burden of a single stalk of corn grown in Iowa is now split between a commuter burning ethanol in their fuel tank in Chicago and a cow digesting the leftover DDGS in a feedlot in Texas.
It deeply structurally entrenches modern meat production within the fossil fuel industry. They are not separate sectors. They are entirely codependent metabolic systems.
Right.
It creates a massive structural lock-in. The global livestock sector becomes fundamentally reliant on an intensive, heavily subsidized, monoculture-based cropping system that is, at its absolute core, entirely dependent on massive fossil fuel inputs. You cannot untangle the modern fast-growing chicken or the heavily marbled feedlot cow from the natural gas well and the chemical plant.
Which brings us to the stark physical reality of all this intense cultivation. Growing 1/3 of the world's cereal just for animal feed, and simultaneously providing open grazing land for billions of ruminants, requires physical geographic space. It requires land.
Huge amounts of land.
And this leads us to what is perhaps the most profound and yet strangely entirely invisible climate impact of the entire agri-food system. Let's talk about land use and deforestation.
When the public discourse focuses on greenhouse gases, we almost exclusively focus on active emissions. The burping cow, the venting soil, the burning tractor exhaust. But the most significant overarching climate impact of global meat consumption is arguably passive.
Passive emissions.
It is the sheer, mind-boggling volume of land that is occupied by the system, land that could otherwise be actively sequestering carbon from the atmosphere if it were left alone.
The macro statistics on agricultural land appropriation are genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The data shows that global agriculture utilizes approximately 50% of the world's habitable, ice-free, and desert-free land.
Half of the usable surface of the Earth.
Humanity has claimed half of the usable surface of the Earth just to grow food. And of that vast agricultural footprint, a staggering 77 to 83% is dedicated exclusively to livestock production. That figure includes both the sprawling pastures for grazing and the highly intensive cropland used to grow the feed we just spent 20 minutes analyzing.
Up to 83% of our agricultural land. Yet, despite occupying that absolutely massive planetary footprint, animal products ultimately supply only about 18% of global human calories and roughly 37% of global protein.
That is just. It's a geometry of profound systemic inefficiency. We are utilizing the vast, overwhelming majority of our productive, life-sustaining land to produce a minority fraction of our actual nutrition.
And because the thermodynamics of the system are so inherently inefficient, losing 90% of the energy to the animal's metabolism, body heat, and methane, the system constantly, aggressively hungers for more physical space to maintain production.
And that insatiable hunger for acreage is what drives the leading edge of global deforestation.
The relentless expansion of pasture for cattle grazing and the clearing of new cropland for soy and corn feed is the primary overarching driver of global deforestation, particularly in the Earth's most sensitive and vital ecological zones, the tropics.
The rainforests.
And when a primary ancient forest is cleared to make way for agriculture, the mechanism of carbon emission is a brutal, twofold hit to the atmosphere.
So it's not just cutting down the tree. What is the first hit?
The first rapid emission is biomass combustion. When tropical forests are cleared, it is rarely done with logging equipment. It is often done via aggressive slash-and-burn techniques. The immense volume of carbon that has been safely, biologically stored for centuries in the massive trunks, the dense branches, the extensive root systems, and the dense canopy leaves of the trees is rapidly oxidized by the fire.
Just burned up immediately.
It is instantly released into the atmosphere as an enormous, visible plume of pure CO2.
And the second hit? Because the fire goes out eventually. What happens next?
The second hit is soil carbon depletion. This is a much slower but ultimately equally devastating biological release. Ancient forests maintain incredibly rich, deep, complex stocks of soil organic carbon, or SOC.
Carbon trapped in the dirt.
This carbon is locked into vast underground fungal networks, and it is protected by the dense shade of the forest canopy, keeping the soil cool and moist. But when you burn that forest and convert it into an open pasture or a tilled soy field, you violently strip away the protective canopy.
The soil just bakes.
The dark soil is suddenly exposed to the direct baking heat of the sun, and the physical-mechanical act of tilling violently breaks apart the delicate soil aggregates. This sudden massive exposure accelerates microbial respiration within the soil.
The microbes wake up and start eating everything.
The microbes go into overdrive, causing the ancient, safely stored carbon to oxidize and slowly, continuously bleed into the atmosphere over decades. Extensive meta-analyses consistently show that converting primary undisturbed forest to active agriculture results in a massive long-term structural depletion of underground soil carbon stocks.
And nowhere on Earth is this twofold hit more visible and frankly more tragic than in the Amazon basin. The research we are reviewing specifically highlights what it calls the Amazon beef nexus.
The numbers attached to this are horrifying.
They really are. Approximately 41% of all global deforestation is attributed directly to the expansion of cattle ranching. That specific activity equates to the absolute loss of 2.1 million hectares of primary forest every single year, strictly to create room for beef production.
To put a specific footprint number on that reality, beef that is produced on recently deforested land in the Amazon carries an immense, almost unfathomable carbon burden.
Right.
When life cycle analysts factor in the massive emission from the burning of the above-ground biomass and the slow, decades-long loss of the below-ground soil carbon, the footprint of that specific beef is estimated at over 700 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per single kilogram of carcass weight.
700 kilograms of CO2 for 1 kilogram of meat. We established earlier that the global average for beef, which is already the highest emitting food on Earth, was around 100 kilograms.
Yes. Amazon deforestation beef is an order of magnitude higher. It is 10 to 20 times more carbon intensive than the already high global average. By consuming it, you are essentially eating the displaced, destroyed rainforest with every single bite.
But this brings us to a conceptual leap in the research that I think is really going to completely change how our listeners view the physical landscape around them. Because it's not just about the specific trees in the Amazon that we're actively cutting down today.
No, it's broader than that.
It's about the trees that could be there anywhere on Earth, but aren't, simply because a cow or a field of feed corn is occupying that space instead.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to introduce a crucial economic and ecological concept, carbon opportunity costs, or COC.
Carbon opportunity cost.
The COC framework represents a massive paradigm shift in how we perform environmental accounting. It forcefully argues that the true, honest climate impact of producing a specific food item must include not just the active direct emissions it causes, the methane burps and the diesel tractors, but it must account for the passive carbon sequestration that the activity actively prevents by occupying the land and suppressing native vegetation.
Can you quantify this ghost forest for us? What are we actually mathematically losing by maintaining all this vast global pasture land?
The research models this explicitly and aggressively. If the global human population were to shift toward a predominantly plant-based diet, the thermodynamic efficiency of calorie and protein delivery to humans would drastically exponentially increase.
Because we bypass the middleman.
Exactly. Because we would no longer be losing 90% of the calories to the animal's metabolism, the sheer physical amount of agricultural land required to feed humanity could be reduced by roughly 75%. We could theoretically shrink our planetary agricultural footprint from 4 billion hectares down to just 1 billion hectares.
We would free up 3 billion hectares of land surface. That is an almost inconceivable amount of space. What actually happens to it in these models?
It actively rewilds. The land released from agricultural servitude, which would predominantly be former cattle pastures and the massive monocrop fields currently growing animal feed, would slowly but surely revert to its native pre-agricultural vegetation.
So forests grow back.
Depending on the specific geographic biome, that means dense forests, deep-rooted grasslands, or sprawling savannas would naturally regrow. And as that massive expanse of native vegetation aggressively expands, it would actively draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through the sheer power of photosynthesis, locking the carbon safely back into woody biomass, root systems, and recovering soils.
And how much carbon are we talking about pulling out of the sky with this biological rewilding?
The peer-reviewed estimates are staggering. The research suggests that this global ecological restoration could sequester between 332 and 547 gigatons of carbon dioxide by the year 2050.
547 gigatons. That number is so astronomically large it almost loses its conceptual meaning.
To contextualize a number that size, that massive sequestration potential is roughly equivalent to 9 to 16 years of current total global fossil fuel emissions from every single human activity combined.
Wow.
The cars, the power plants, the factories.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. We are talking about essentially buying humanity a decade and a half of atmospheric breathing room to completely re-engineer the global energy grid simply by changing how we functionally use the surface of the Earth.
It completely changes the timeline.
It completely changes how I view a drive through the countryside. When I drive by a sprawling green field of cows now, I'm not going to see a serene, peaceful farm scene. I'm going to see an invisible lost forest. I'm going to see a void of missing biodiversity. We are paying a massive daily planetary rent in lost carbon sequestration just to maintain the physical space required for animal agriculture. The carbon opportunity cost of a steak is often significantly larger than the actual methane the cow burps during its lifetime.
Precisely. The opportunity cost dwarfs the active emissions. And that is why land use is perhaps the most critical yet under-discussed metric in climate science.
Absolutely.
But while the farm, the complex feed chemistry, and the massive land use dominate the front end of the footprint, the physical journey of that meat isn't over. Once the animal reaches slaughter weight and leaves the farm gate, it enters an entirely different, highly industrialized matrix of emissions.
We have to follow the physical product from the farm to the supermarket display case, which brings us to the industrial tale of the supply chain processing, deep refrigeration, and global logistics.
Right, because meat doesn't just magically teleport from a pasture to the supermarket aisle.
No, it has to be slaughtered, heavily processed, safely packaged, and crucially, kept constantly artificially cold. Let's start at the initial processing facility, the abattoir. We're moving away from the slow biology of the farm and back into the realm of heavy, energy-dense industry.
Modern abattoirs are incredibly, almost shockingly energy-dense operations. They operate at the highly regulated intersection of heavy mechanical engineering and incredibly stringent biological safety and sanitation standards, both of which require massive, continuous inputs of power.
They need a lot of heat and water, right?
They require substantial, continuous thermal energy, mostly derived from burning natural gas in massive on-site boilers, for heating millions of gallons of water used for constant facility cleaning, carcass scalding, and equipment sterilization.
And electricity.
Simultaneously, they require immense, continuous electrical energy to run the heavy automated machinery, the pneumatic saws, the miles of conveyor belts, and the massive facility-wide on-site refrigeration plants that must rapidly drop the temperature of thousands of carcasses.
The source data gives us some highly specific granular numbers here. Processing a single ton of beef requires approximately 775 kilowatt hours of energy. For sheep meat, it's roughly 685 kilowatt hours per ton. If I'm looking at the machinery inside, what exactly is pulling all that immense power?
It varies significantly by the species being processed, but let's look at heavy pig processing as an operational example. One of the primary, highly energy-intensive steps is singeing.
Burning off the hair.
Yes, where the massive carcass is passed directly through open, roaring flames to rapidly burn off the hair. This continuous thermal process consumes massive volumes of fossil gas. Then the carcass moves into scalding tanks, massive, continuously heated vats of near-boiling water to chemically loosen the skin.
That takes a lot of energy to keep boiling.
Further down the line, the deboning and primal cutting lines are increasingly fully automated, heavily reliant on complex robotics and pneumatics, which significantly raises the facility's baseline electrical load.
And then there's the sheer volume of water moving through the building.
The water consumption required to maintain sanitation is staggering. A large processing facility can consume up to 40,000 liters of water per single ton of product processed.
40,000 liters per ton.
Every single drop of that water has to be actively pumped from a municipal source or a deep well into the facility, heavily heated using natural gas. And then, crucially, all of that contaminated biological wastewater must be pumped out and aggressively treated in massive, energy-hungry on-site wastewater facilities before it can legally be released into the environment.
Just moving that fluid around takes a ton of electricity.
All of that fluid movement entails massive, continuous electrical pumping costs. Furthermore, there is the intense, largely hidden process of rendering.
Rendering, that's the industrial process for dealing with the massive volume of biological material from the animal that humans don't actually eat. Right?
Yeah.
The heavy bones, the excess fat, the offal.
Yes, rendering takes those massive biological byproducts and essentially boils them down inside massive pressure cookers under high temperature and high pressure to create industrial tallow, usable fats, and dried bone meal for other industries.
Like pet food or cosmetics.
Exactly. It is an extremely high temperature, highly energy-intensive, continuous thermal process that adds a highly significant burden to the processing facility's overall life cycle carbon footprint.
So the meat is finally processed, it is sterile, it's packaged in plastic, and now it has to be shipped to the consumer. And because raw animal products are highly perishable and incredible vectors for dangerous bacterial pathogens, they require the maintenance of something called an unbroken cold chain.
The cold chain is vital.
From the exact second that animal's temperature is dropped in the abattoir to the moment I put it in my frying pan at home, it has to stay in an artificially cold environment. And that absolute reliance on endless, uninterrupted refrigeration introduces us to a truly terrifying class of industrial chemicals, superpollutants.
We are talking specifically about hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Because the global cold chain cannot fail without risking massive foodborne illness, the industry relies on millions of massive commercial vapor compression refrigeration systems. And the grim physical reality of complex commercial refrigeration systems with their miles of copper piping, thousands of pressurized valves, and vibrating compressors is that they inevitably leak.
I really want to slow down and focus on this because the data from the EPA on this specific point completely stopped me in my tracks when I read the sources. When we walk into a supermarket freezer aisle, we perceive it as this highly sterile, hermetically sealed, perfectly engineered environment.
But it's actually leaking constantly.
It is actually a massive active node of invisible, highly potent industrial emissions. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that the average modern supermarket leaks approximately 25% of its entire chemical refrigerant charge every single year.
25?
One full quarter of the highly pressurized gas inside the system just bleeds out invisibly into the atmosphere through microscopic fissures in the pipes, faulty valve seals, and deferred maintenance.
And it is absolutely vital to understand the extreme chemical potency of what exactly is leaking out of those pipes. These commercial systems frequently utilize a specific refrigerant gas called R404A.
R404A.
While it was engineered specifically so it doesn't chemically deplete the ozone layer like older generations of CFC refrigerants did, it acts as a catastrophic greenhouse gas in the lower atmosphere. The specific molecular structure of R404A gives it a global warming potential that is 3,922 times that of carbon dioxide.
Almost 4,000 times worse than CO2. A single pound of this invisible gas traps as much heat as 2 tons of carbon dioxide. So when you do the math on a massive standard grocery store leaking a full quarter of its R404A inventory into the sky every single year, the EPA states that a single supermarket's annual entirely invisible refrigerant leaks can be equivalent to the CO2 emissions of over 300 passenger cars driving continuously for a full year.
300 cars.
Just from one stationary building keeping its display cases cold.
And that immense leakage is just from the stationary, relatively stable supermarkets. The cold chain is also highly mobile. Think of the millions of refrigerated transport trucks, the reefers you see on the highway, and the massive shipping containers crossing the oceans.
They all need their own fridges.
These mobile units utilize independent, highly active cooling units that are almost entirely powered by separate, small, highly inefficient diesel generators strapped directly to the front of the trailer.
So they are burning extra diesel fuel strictly to run the heavy compressor for the fridge, independent of the truck's engine.
Yes, emitting steady streams of CO2 and localized particulate matter directly from the combustion. But the far worse problem is mechanical. Because these mobile units are constantly hurtling down rough highways, bouncing violently over potholes, and enduring extreme weather shifts, the physical refrigeration architecture is subjected to immense, constant physical vibrations and mechanical stress.
And that shakes the pipes loose.
This physical reality makes mobile refrigeration units incredibly prone to astronomically high rates of refrigerant leakage. The superpollutant gas is literally vibrating right out of the pressurized fittings as the truck drives.
It really paints a profoundly overwhelming picture. When I look at a simple package of beef sitting under the fluorescent lights in the freezer aisle, I'm no longer just looking at a piece of food. I'm looking at the physical culmination of an incredible globe-spanning journey of compounding emissions.
It's a massive chain.
I'm looking at the biogenic methane from the archaea and the rumen. I'm looking at the nitrous oxide volatilizing from the pasture. I'm looking at the natural gas violently burned to make the synthetic fertilizer for the corn, the massive displaced carbon from the deforested land in the Amazon, the massive electrical draw of the mechanized slaughterhouse, and finally the slow, highly potent, invisible bleed of superpollutant HFCs keeping the display case cold.
It is a phenomenal, almost incomprehensible aggregation of disparate variables, which leads us to the absolutely critical foundational question of climate science policy. How do scientists and regulators take all of those wildly disparate variables, from rumen archaea biology to diesel exhaust to atmospheric decay rates of R404A, and calculate a single mathematically comparable carbon footprint number that a regulator or a consumer can actually use?
This brings us to the most fiercely contested territory in the research, the accounting battles. Because in the realm of global policy, defining the mathematical metric defines the ultimate solution. If the math changes, the required regulations change. How do life cycle analysts actually calculate this universal ledger?
The rigorous scientific standard for this level of extreme quantification is known as life cycle assessment, or LCA. An LCA attempts to draw a strict, mathematically defined boundary around the entire sprawling system and meticulously account for every single physical input and every single gaseous emission from cradle to grave.
So it's very comprehensive.
The absolute gold standard for this data currently comes from a massive groundbreaking meta-analysis by researchers Poor and Nemechek, which aggressively aggregated and normalized data from over 38,000 commercial farms across 119 different countries.
Let's walk the listener through this established hierarchy of footprints. We've mentioned some of these numbers in passing, but let's lay them out clearly, methodically. The metric here is kilograms of CO2 equivalent for every single kilogram of food product delivered. At the absolute, undisputed top of the pyramid is beef produced from a dedicated beef herd.
Yes. Beef herd beef sits at an astonishing, highly intensive 99.48 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of meat.
99.48.
The primary overwhelming drivers of that extreme number are the massive enteric methane volumes we mapped out, the staggering land use and carbon opportunity cost of grazing, and the generally low feed-to-weight conversion ratio of a cow compared to a highly optimized chicken.
Next down the list is lamb and mutton at 39.72. Still extremely high, driven fundamentally by the biological fact that sheep are also fermenters, ruminants producing enteric methane, and they occupy vast tracts of pasture that aggressively emit nitrous oxide.
Correct. The biology of the rumen dictates their position near the top.
Then we have a really interesting counterintuitive data point. Beef originating from a dairy herd sits at 33.3. So dairy beef is less than half the carbon footprint of herd beef. But wait, they are both cows. They both have a rumen, they both have methanogenic archaea, they both burp methane, and they both eat massive amounts of feed. Why is the math so wildly different?
This specific discrepancy introduces a highly critical, heavily debated concept in life cycle assessments known as the allocation problem.
The allocation problem.
When a complex industrial or biological system produces multiple distinct economically valuable outputs, the strict LCA methodology requires that the analyst allocate or mathematically split the total environmental burden of the system between those specific outputs.
So if a factory makes two different things, they both get a share of the pollution bill. How does that work for a biological animal?
Think about the life cycle of a dedicated beef cow. It is born, it lives for perhaps 2 years on pasture and feedlot, constantly eating and burping methane, and then it is slaughtered strictly for meat.
Right, its only job is to become meat.
Furthermore, it required a massive mother cow to be maintained year-round just to give birth to it, and that mother cow's maintenance emissions are also mathematically assigned directly to the calf's meat. Therefore, that specific meat carries 100% of the massive carbon burden of that entire multi-year biological life cycle.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, consider the life of a highly productive dairy cow. A dairy cow lives for several years, actively, continuously producing thousands upon thousands of gallons of milk. Eventually, her milk production naturally declines, she is culled from the herd, and she is slaughtered, entering the beef supply chain most often as ground beef.
Ah, I see the math. So because she was functionally doing two jobs for the economy, producing milk and then meat, the LCA methodology splits the historical bill.
Exactly. The total environmental burden of her entire life, all the methane burped, all the heavily fertilized feed consumed, the massive manure lagoons generated, is divided mathematically between the massive volume of milk she produced over her life and the meat she eventually becomes.
So the milk takes on a lot of the carbon debt.
Because the sheer volume of milk absorbs a massive portion of the life cycle carbon accounting, the resulting dairy beef appears significantly lower on the footprint scale at 33.30.
That makes perfect sense from an economic accounting perspective, even if the strict biological emissions flowing into the atmosphere from the farm were identical. Continuing our way down the list, cheese sits at 23.88. Why so high for cheese? It's just processed milk.
Because cheese is essentially highly concentrated fluid milk, it takes roughly 10 liters of raw fluid milk to produce just 1 single kilogram of dense, hard cheese.
10-to-1 ratio.
So you are taking the carbon footprint of a liter of milk, multiplying it by 10, and then aggressively adding in the highly significant industrial, thermal, and electrical energy required to heat the vats, curdle the proteins, press the massive wheels, and carefully age the dairy in climate-controlled facilities for months or years.
Then the numbers drop significantly as we move to the monogastrics. Pork sits at 12.31, driven predominantly by those massive anaerobic methane-producing manure lagoons and the embedded fossil fuels of the soy feed.
Right. Lower than beef, but still significant.
Poultry meat is at 9.87, almost entirely driven by the Haber-Bosch natural gas embedded in the massive amounts of corn and soy feed. Eggs are even lower at 4.67, primarily because a modern laying hen is an incredibly, almost ruthlessly metabolically efficient biological machine at converting feed grain into egg mass over her lifetime.
Yes, very efficient converters.
And then you cross the biological boundary from animal products to plant products, and the numbers absolutely precipitously plummet. Tofu is at 3.16, driven mostly by the tractor diesel for crop cultivation and the heavy industrial energy required to boil and process the raw soybeans.
The plant baselines are just inherently lower.
And sitting at the absolute bottom of our list, representing the legumes, are basic green peas at just 0.98. Less than 1 single kilogram of carbon for a kilogram of highly nutritious peas compared to 99 kilograms for beef. What makes peas so incredibly thermodynamically efficient?
Because peas, like all legumes, perform an extraordinary biological magic trick that fundamentally bypasses the fossil fuel industry. They are nitrogen-fixing crops.
Meaning they make their own fertilizer.
They have evolved a deep symbiotic relationship with specialized rhizobia bacteria that live in nodules on their roots. These bacteria have the exact same ability as the massive Haber-Bosch chemical plant. They can pull inert nitrogen straight out of the ambient air and fix it into the soil for the plant to use.
Oh.
Therefore, a massive commercial pea farm requires almost absolutely zero synthetic fossil fuel-derived Haber-Bosch fertilizer. By growing peas, you eliminate the massive natural gas requirement, you drastically reduce the volatile nitrous oxide emissions venting from the soil, and they require minimal low-energy post-harvest processing. It is arguably the most thermodynamically, chemically, and spatially efficient way to produce complex protein on planet Earth.
The mathematical hierarchy is completely undeniable. But as with any multi-billion-dollar, globally entrenched industry facing a massive data problem, there is intense pushback on how the core data is fundamentally calculated. The source material outlines a major, highly consequential accounting battle currently raging at the highest levels of climate science over how we calculate the atmospheric impact of methane itself. It's called the GWP controversy, Global Warming Potential Star. What exactly is this new math about?
It is a highly technical debate over climate metrics that has massive real-world regulatory implications. Traditionally, for decades, international agreements have used a metric called GWP 100, which mathematically compares how much total heat a specific gas traps over a rigid 100-year period compared directly to carbon dioxide.
Okay, so that's the old standard.
But the global livestock industry has been lobbying heavily for the widespread adoption of a new, highly complex metric called GWP.
Why do they want to fundamentally change the math? Is the old math wrong?
They argue that GWP 100 fundamentally misrepresents how methane actually behaves in the atmosphere over time, and chemically they are correct that methane behaves entirely differently than CO2.
How so?
Carbon dioxide is incredibly stable. It stays trapped in the atmosphere for centuries. It accumulates continuously, steadily piling up like indestructible trash in a landfill. Methane, however, is a short-lived climate pollutant. It is highly reactive, and it is naturally broken down and oxidized in the atmosphere by hydroxyl radicals in roughly 12 years.
So it disappears relatively quickly.
The industry fiercely argues that GWP is a vastly more accurate metric because it explicitly accounts for this rapid 12-year decay rate. Under the mathematics of GWP, if a country or a massive corporate farm keeps its total herd size exactly, perfectly stable, meaning a rate of new methane currently being burped by the cows, simply replaces the exact volume of old methane from 12 years ago that is currently breaking down, their calculated newly added warming effect drops mathematically to near zero.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the implication of that. So under this new GWP math, a massive, vertically integrated million-cow feedlot that has been operating for 20 years could technically claim on paper to be climate neutral, simply as long as they don't expand the operation to 1,000,001 cows.
Exactly. The industry heavily favors the adoption of GWP because it mathematically allows massive, historically stable, high-volume emitters to simply maintain the highly profitable status quo and legally claim climate neutrality without actually having to reduce their absolute physical volume of emissions by a single ton.
This raises an important question. If they are still physically burping millions of tons of incredibly potent methane into the sky every single year, how can that possibly be framed as good for the climate? Are we just playing complex accounting games to protect a legacy industry, or are we trying to actively, physically cool the planet? What do independent climate scientists say about the widespread adoption of this metric?
Leading climate scientists have issued incredibly strong, urgent warnings about the potential misuse and misinterpretation of GWP. They acknowledge that it is physically, thermodynamically true that a perfectly stable herd does not increase global temperatures further than they already are.
But the temperature is already too high.
Right. What the GWP math dangerously masks is that the stable herd is actively, forcefully maintaining global temperatures at a highly elevated, highly dangerous level. It is acting as a massive heat engine, holding the global temperature high.
It's like keeping your hand pressed firmly on a hot stove. You aren't turning the dial up any higher, but you are still actively, continuously getting burned by the heat you are maintaining.
That is the exact physical reality. And the scientific counterpoint to the industry's push is vital to understand. Precisely because methane is short-lived, aggressively reducing it provides humanity with the single fastest, most effective mechanism to achieve active, measurable atmospheric cooling within our own lifetimes.
Because it washes out so fast.
Because of that 12-year decay rate, if you drastically cut physical methane emissions today within a single decade, that gas physically breaks down and its massive warming effect completely disappears from the atmosphere.
That's a huge opportunity.
By adopting a metric like GWP that mathematically rewards merely stabilizing emissions at historically high levels, scientists warn it might entirely disincentivize the aggressive absolute methane reduction strategies that are absolutely critical for limiting near-term catastrophic warming tipping points. It is viewed by many as a clever accounting trick that masks the incredible potential for a desperately needed, rapid climate victory.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly deep journey today. Let's zoom back out and look at the entire massive interconnected machine. Here's where it gets really interesting, taking all of this in together. We started our deep dive by intentionally dismantling the old tailpipe paradigm.
We covered a lot of ground.
And what we have meticulously mapped out is that the massive 16.5 billion tons of emissions from meat and dairy aren't just an accidental byproduct of bad management. They aren't a simple glitch that can be easily fixed with a quick, shiny technological patch, a new solar panel on the barn, or buying an electric delivery truck for the supermarket.
No, they absolutely cannot. The deep structural emissions of this system are fundamentally inextricably rooted in the inescapable thermodynamics of biological machines. They are deeply rooted in the ancient evolutionary mandate of the rumen to expel hydrogen as methane simply to survive.
They are chemically rooted in the complex nitrogen cycle of massive volumes of manure breaking down in oxygen-fluctuating environments.
And they are rooted in the massive fossil fuel-dependent physics of synthesizing synthetic ammonia to grow millions of acres of feed, and the sheer, staggering spatial inefficiency of using half the planet's habitable surface just to grow it.
We've talked extensively about potential technological interventions, precision feeding with amino acids, or capturing some methane gas from an anaerobic manure lagoon. But looking at the entire massive scope of the data we've covered, what is the ultimate overarching takeaway here? Can technological innovation truly save the fundamental architecture of this system?
The scientific consensus presented across these vast meta-analyses is quite calm, but it is absolutely unwavering on this specific point. While technological improvements, things like engineered chemical feed additives to temporarily suppress the archaeomethanogens, vastly better engineered manure digesters, or aggressively transitioning to renewable electricity in the highly intensive slaughterhouse cold chain, while these can yield highly necessary marginal reductions, the core biological and severe ecological costs remain entirely intact.
Marginal reductions, but not a cure.
The fundamental baseline thermodynamics of converting massive volumes of plant energy into small volumes of animal protein through the living bodies of cows, pigs, and chickens is inescapably mathematically inefficient. The data unequivocally repeatedly demonstrates that the sheer scale of global consumption of animal products is the primary absolute driver of food system emissions, due entirely to the unchangeable biological reality of the animals themselves.
And that profound realization leaves us with a massive, necessary shift in our planetary perspective. If we strip away the comforting pastoral imagery, the red barns, the green fields, and if we look at our modern global food system through the cold, hard, unforgiving lens of pure thermodynamics, molecular carbon chemistry, and spatial inefficiency, we have to ask ourselves a fundamental, deeply uncomfortable question about how we use the Earth.
It really forces a hard look at the choices we make.
We spent this entire time talking about the carbon math and the thermodynamic inefficiency. But let's look past the carbon for a moment. If shifting diets could actually free up 3 billion hectares of land, of physical space roughly the size of the entire continent of Africa, we aren't just talking about a math trick to balance a carbon ledger.
We are talking about radically, fundamentally rewriting the future of global biodiversity.
what actually happens to global geopolitics, to human psychology, and to the trajectory of thousands of endangered species when the Earth suddenly regains a vast, sprawling, interconnected wilderness that we haven't seen since the Pleistocene.
It's a staggering possibility.
We aren't just deciding what's for dinner. We are deciding whether the future of the planet is a heavily fertilized feedlot or a restored wild Earth. If we look at our food system through the lens of pure thermodynamics and land efficiency, we have to ask ourselves, is animal agriculture actually a food production system? Or is it the world's least efficient energy grid where we pour massive amounts of fossil fuels, land, and plant calories into a biological machine only to lose 90% of it as waste heat and greenhouse gas before it ever reaches our plate? Something for you to deeply think about next time you walk down the supermarket freezer aisle, looking past the pristine plastic packaging to the invisible, incredibly complex, world-altering reality behind it. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.